Welcome and thank you for joining me for this week's series of daily devotionals. If this is the first time you've been with us, we have been going through the book of James, the small book of James, only 5 chapters, and yet many have referred to it as kind of the book of Proverbs of the New Testament. The fact is it just has very short, concise statements that bring a lot of wisdom and insight into dealing with the day-to-day struggles. Whereas the book of Proverbs dealt with being a moral man or woman in general, the book of James is more specific. It talks about how that we can practically deal with the challenges and issues we face as followers of Jesus Christ, most particularly trials and temptations. And where we want to pick up our reading is in chapter 1 today, in verse 21, where Paul begins talking about the dark side or the downside of the Christian journey when we yield to temptation, we get overtaken, and we fall into traps. How do we keep from doing that? Well, on one hand, we have to understand that the reason that the gospel of grace is called the gospel of grace is because none of us are perfect and we are in constant need of grace. And ironically, or importantly, none of us are any better than anybody else. And I think that's part of one of the real dangers. That's kind of what breeds a religious spirit in people where they think, well, I've never done that, so therefore I am better than you are. When in fact, you may in fact be better in that area, but are there other areas where you have slipped and fallen and maybe have fallen far short of the glory of God in your life? So the issue of this kind of comparison becomes a false comparison. If I compare myself with you or you with me, we might be able to see ourselves as being better in some areas than in others. But when we compare ourselves, the comparison should not be between ourselves, as Paul said to the Corinthians. It should be our comparison to Christ. And when I look at myself in the light of Christ's righteousness, I realize that I have nothing to boast about. Paul put it very simply. He said, our righteousness is like filthy rags. The best I can be is like, I can excuse the graphicness of it, but literally the term means a used menstrual cloth. That there's nothing that I can point to and say, here is my glory. Rather, it's pointing to something that shows that I am a sinner. In fact, the moment I boast, I reveal the most central sin that we all are guilty of, and that's pride. So when we talk about the fall of Satan, you have to understand it was pride that led him to exalt himself and to basically say, I will become and I will rise up to. It's that idea of self-determination, as if I have ultimate control over the direction and the trajectory of my life. Yes, we make choices. Yes, in the end, we're responsible. But I think when you think about living in a cause and effect world, where God really makes a difference is that we may be the cause, but Christ ultimately is the effect. That He causes the things in my life to work together for the good. That's where the grace comes into play. So I may cause the grace to move in the sense that I respond positively what God says, but it's really God having an effect upon my life, touching my life in ways. And most often it's this dual interplay between mercy and grace. He shows me mercy. In other words, He doesn't give me what I deserve. He shows me grace. He gives me what I do not deserve. He enriches me far above what I should be enriched, when I should be actually facing poverty because of my sinfulness. So when you begin to understand this balance, it changes your attitude not only towards yourself, because you recognize that you're no longer being measured by how good or bad you are, but rather you're being measured by the righteousness of Christ. But secondly, it also makes you more compassionate upon other people. Because one of the problems we have, and one of the things is a disturbing religious spirit, as we often call it, is the idea that somehow I am better than other people because I know Christ. When I see people making really harmful, self-destructive choices, what saddens me isn't that their behavior is immoral, but what saddens me is the fact of what immorality creates or brings us to in our life. That's why those behaviors are basically self-destructive behaviors. And that's why this is the reason really why Paul says in verse 21, James says in verse 21, he says, therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent. He says we should make that our objective, to rid those things from our lives. And in a sense, when moral filth and evil are removed from my life as a part of my lifestyle or the trajectory of my life, then I can say good riddance to that. Because the idea is these are troublesome and unwanted things. They need to be gotten out of my life. And there are two types of categories that he puts our behavior in. One is immoral habits. That's what moral filth is. It's habits that go against the will of God, the nature of God. And they can become very subtle and difficult to identify. I mean, lying, cheating, stealing, but bragging, boasting, hating, envying, anger, resentments, malice. These are all things that can become habitual in a person's life, and they become so habitual that they become also comfortable, and we don't even recognize them when we're walking in them. And so he says part of the objective of God is for us to see those things and to get rid of them. How? By confessing them, by telling God, this is in my life. And along with those things, he talks about evil. That is the harmful or damaging attitudes and behaviors that often grow out of a morally distorted mind, a mind that has been shaped and formed and warped and damaged by the influences of sin in the world around us. And so he says we get rid of those things by simply bringing them to the altar of Christ and acknowledging, God, this is wrong. I shouldn't say those kinds of things. I shouldn't think those kind of things. I shouldn't behave in those sorts of ways. And I'll leave it to you to fill in the blanks under those categories. But the simple fact is those things, if they're not confessed, he goes on to say that they become prevalent in our life. And literally, the word is translated rampant or flourishing or spreading unchecked. In other words, it's a plethora of bad behaviors that come to an excessive amount of expression in our lives. In other words, we can form good behavioral habits or we can form negative behavioral habits. None of them will stay in place. None of them will just reserve and content themselves to be where they are. If you're pursuing godliness, you'll desire more and more godliness in your life. You'll want to know Christ more perfectly, and you'll want to walk after his ways more faithfully. But if you're pursuing something that's immoral or disreputable, that will become its own addiction as well. And the only thing that will break you from it is when you begin to reap the consequences. One leads to joy, the other leads to sorrow. And so this becomes a noble purpose. So I guess what I'd like to wrap it up today by simply saying, let's see if we can kind of resolve that today we're going to pray that God would rid us of any kind of immoral habits that we have. Just simply lying or stealing paper clips from the office or something that's evil. In other words, it's a harmful and damaging behavior that we engage in, which can be just simply things that we do with our mouth, like backbiting and accusing and so forth. Let's ask God, rid those things from me, Lord. I ask you to begin to search me and know my heart and show me if there's any wicked way in me. And he'll be faithful to do it. God bless you and go in his continuing grace.